A week ago, something happened that almost no one noticed. The president issued an executive order prioritizing the production of glyphosate under the Defense Production Act. In other words, one of the most villainous herbicides in history just became classified as essential to national defense. Now, when you hear that, the obvious question is, what does an herbicide have to do with national security? And more importantly, what does that mean for the food that your family is eating? Because once you understand the answer to that question, you're going to start to see the modern food system very differently. All right, here's the backstory. On February 18, 2026, an executive order was issued under the Defense Production Act. And the order prioritizes domestic production of glyphosate and elemental phosphorus. Now, the stated goal with this is to protect the agriculture supply chains and reduce the reliance on foreign countries, particularly China. But in very simple terms, what happened is that the government stepped in and said that the supply chain for chemicals is too important to risk disruption. Okay, well, on the surface, that sounds like routine agricultural policy, but when you step back, it reveals something far, far bigger. It shows how dependent our modern food system is on the chemicals that so many producers use. And when an herbicide becomes a matter of national defense, it forces a much deeper question for us to answer. And this is not a question around politics. It's a question about priorities. If public health were the primary driver of food policy, which logically you would think that that's what it would be, you would expect a massive investment in farming systems that reduce chemical dependence. Instead, this decision, this executive order, reinforces the very inputs that the system that's really just for straight up, acknowledgement is a broken system. And it tells us something very important about how the modern food system actually operates. Before we go any further, I want to read you a line directly from the executive order. If you want to read this for yourself, it's pretty easy to find this online. But it says that glyphosate-based herbicides play a critical role in maintaining America's agricultural advantage and allow farmers to produce food and livestock feed efficiently while keeping food affordable for American families. Now again, on the surface, that does sound responsible. It sounds like the government is protecting farmers and protecting the food supply. But when you start breaking that statement down piece by piece, it becomes clear that the premise behind it is deeply, deeply flawed. Because the way this is framed assumes that the only way American food or America can produce food is through a chemical dependent system. And that just simply isn't true. There's too much evidence out there now to show that when we use regenerative based systems, we don't have to rely on this chemical dependency. What it really shows is how dependent our current agricultural model has become on inputs that are benefiting the corporations that are supplying them. So instead of asking how we transition away from chemical dependence, this policy, this executive order reinforces that. And that is where this conversation becomes extremely important. Again, not politically, but structurally, because the assumption that this statement makes is that it's shaping the entire direction of American agriculture. I read that line out of the executive order because I wanted to highlight and break down a few pieces of that language. The first of which is that glyphosate is critical for livestock feed. The order, as we said, it states that glyphosate plays a critical role in feeding livestock. But that statement only holds true if you accept the current model of livestock production, which is built around feedlots, corn, soy, large monocrop grain systems. Ruminant animals were never designed to eat grain in the first place. Maybe they eat some grasses that ultimately can grow grains, but they're not designed to live and thrive off of grains. The rumen of these animals does not thrive off excessive grain exposure. Cattle are grazing animals. They evolved to eat grass and legumes and forbs and turn that into nutrient-dense food. When cattle are raised on pasture, glyphosate is not required to produce their feed. You don't need these monocrop systems. And in fact, the most natural feed systems for cattle requires absolutely no chemical input whatsoever. You can plant a crop of corn if you want to and allow grasses and weeds to grow all along inside of that, right? Just allow the weeds to grow in there and just turn the cattle directly into it. The cattle will go into that field and they will eat. And the cattle will go harvest that corn. There's no combines. There's no trucking grains to storage facilities to the silos. You don't have to then truck the grains to the feedlots. All these expenses that come through this system, they're all eliminated. You're not using chemicals as desiccants at the end of the growing season to get the crops to dry down faster, much less the fact that you're also using these chemicals as herbicides and pesticides. All of that stuff goes away. It's just a different way of thinking about using the resources that we have to be able to feed these animals and when that feeding actually takes place. You're literally, like, listen, if you're a farmer and you're listening to this and you just say, I just want to plant that corn crop, fine, go plant that corn crop. And after these animals have harvested off, put your no-till drill on your tractor and go drill the next crop in and let them do the same thing. Harvest it again and keep repeating the cycle. You can transition the land back to a diverse pasture if you want to, but use a regenerative mindset. And for that, glyphosate is not essential. The next piece of language that was in that statement in the executive order was that glyphosate supports the rural economy. I think anyone that logically thinks through this will know just what a ridiculous statement this is. It says that glyphosate is a cornerstone of the rural economy. If that right there doesn't just make you stop in your tracks, I don't really know what will. If you spend any time talking to farmers, to ranchers that are doing this, and this is their sole means of income, you're going to quickly realize that that statement doesn't even come close to matching reality. Because every year, farmers are spending thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars on chemical inputs. Herbicides, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers. Glyphosate is just one piece of this bigger, larger chemical package that many traditional or conventional producers have found themselves entrapped in. And these dollars do not stay in rural economies, in these rural communities. That's not where they're hanging out at, right? They leave the farm and flow directly back to these multinational chemical companies. So instead of strengthening the rural economy, the system is actually draining the wealth out of that environment. It's draining the wealth out of that community. And farmers get caught up in this cycle, and the cycle keeps cascading and snowballing on them year over year, that they have to buy more inputs each successive season to get and try to maintain the same yields. And what does that do to margins? It makes them tighter. It increases debt. And the local economy becomes more dependent on outside corporations. This isn't creating a strong rural economy. It's a system that slowly pulls economic power away from the people and that are producing the food, and it shifts it to these multinational corporations. Glyphosate is not the backbone of a rural economy. In many ways, it's the very vehicle in which money leaves the rural economy. Now, this executive order wouldn't have been good old political language. This is not one side or the other, right? This is just typical political language that you see if it didn't also bring into the conversation the affordable food argument. This order argues that glyphosate helps ensure affordable food for American families, but that framing only measures the cost of food at the grocery store. It ignores the long-term cost. the healthcare costs, the environmental degradation costs, the declining soil health, and the rising burden of chronic disease. And if you're saying to yourself, well, these chronic diseases aren't manifesting to the later decades of life. Well, turns out that we're now linking glyphosate exposure to chronic conditions that are happening in the first 2 and 3 decades of life. So that logic doesn't make sense anymore. So when you only calculate the short-term price of food, you miss the larger economic picture and the drain that these chronic conditions and a detrimental effect of these toxic exposures has on our national economy. What's the real issue behind this policy? Well, remember, this executive order is being framed as part of national security. But what it actually protects is the infrastructure of chemical-dependent agriculture system. And when billions of dollars move through that system every year, yes, that's billions with a B, the companies supplying those chemicals have enormous influence over policy. And that is part of the conversation that most people aren't hearing. You're not seeing the talking heads out there discussing these realities. Because once a system becomes financially and politically entrenched as the chemical system of agriculture currently has, it becomes very difficult to challenge that system and to have an opposing voice. Here's what I want you to pay attention to, and this is especially true if you are a parent. The consequences of these decisions, they're not staying inside of policy documents, okay? They move through the food system. They're into the grains that are being put into processed foods that are being fed to livestock and that eventually find their way into the diet of the American public. And children are among some of the most vulnerable to these exposures. And the connection there is just simply that their immune system has not maturated to the level to be able to handle this onslaught of toxic exposure. We as adults can't handle it very well, much less a kid. So it raises the question, which is a really difficult question, but it is a question that has to be put out there, is And it's one that policymakers don't want to address, but it's that if the long-term health of the population were truly the priority here, we would continue reinforcing a system that moves us away from chemical inputs, that makes us less dependent on these in the first place, because the strongest form truly of national security isn't a chemical stored up somewhere. It's a healthy population. When you take a step back and you look at all of this, one thing becomes very clear. Waiting for the system to correct itself is probably not the answer. Your policies change slowly, if at all, and industries are rich and they're going to protect themselves. They're going to have very strong lobbying efforts. And large agriculture systems rarely move away from the tools that they're dependent on. So these are all just the facts and just easy data points that we can connect over literally multiple decades now. So the real leverage families have is never going to be in Washington, D.C. But it is much closer to home, which should sound pretty nice for you. It's in the relationships that you choose to build with the people that are producing your food. Know the rancher that's raising your beef, or know where your chicken's coming from, what farmer's producing that. When you can ask questions about the land, about how it's managed, about the production systems, how the animals are being raised, you're removing so much of the uncertainty that is always going to be hidden in the industrial food system. You're no longer relying on labels, and you're relying on trust and transparency, something that labels and the conventional food system is never ever going to give you. And something else begins to happen when you and your family start buying from a local producer. That money, it stays closer to home. It stays closer to the land and to where the food is being produced. And it strengthens a small agricultural operation that is a completely different type of environment for food production. And it supports a system that is going to prioritize soil health, animal health, and most important to you and your family's health. That's how the food system actually changes. It's not from the top down. That you can forget that. That's not going to happen. It's from the bottom up. And that's when you start to see relationships develop. You start to see that your food dollars actually begin to make an impact, because in the end, the strongest form of food security, it's not chemical production. It has nothing to do with chemical production. It's in a community connected to the people growing and raising the food. If you want to understand the difference between conventional and regeneratively raised proteins, I've put together another video that breaks down why clean, pasture-raised proteins can have such a powerful impact on your health. Take a few minutes and go ahead and watch that next. It's going to help you connect the dots between the food system we just talked about and the kind of nutrition that actually supports long-term health.